In this lecture, we are going to discuss Thomson's article titled A Defense of Abortion. This is perhaps one of the most widely recognized articles on the topic of abortion. It's in virtually every single anthology, Intro to Ethics and Intro to Philosophy in general. This is perhaps the standard argument that's offered in support of the pro-choice position. So let's go ahead and take a look at see what Thomson's view actually says. So Thomson's position is pro-choice, but interestingly, Thomson does not try to argue that the fetus is not a person. Thomson recognizes that oftentimes the problem of abortion boils down to disputes about whether or not the fetus is going to count as a person. So Thomson recognizes that this is an important tension in the whole debate about abortion. And Thomson wants to try to show that pro-life position is not going to work, but Thomson's not going to try to do that by showing that the fetus is not a person. Instead, Thomson wants to have some sort of neutral ground. Thomson wants to agree with the advocate of the pro-life position. So what Thomson does is she just assumes, for the sake of the argument, that the pro-life position is true with regard to whether or not the fetus is a person, right? Thomson starts off by saying, let's just take it as being true that the fetus is a person from the very moment of conception, right? So that way we have a neutral ground, a point of agreement for both sides of the position, right? So we're going to assume, for the sake of argument, that the fetus is a person from the very moment of conception. Thomson believes that we can still show that abortion is sometimes morally permissible, even if we're already assuming that the fetus is a person, right? So that's kind of the reason why Thomson's argument is considered to be one of the most important arguments in this entire literature, because she goes about showing that abortion is still morally permissible, even if it's true that the fetus is a person from the very moment of conception, right? So the kind of the way that this is going to work is it's going to be weighing two different rights, the right to life versus the woman's right to autonomy, the woman's right to do what she wants to with her body. So which of these two rights is going to have precedent, right? That's kind of the question that's at hand. Thomson's opponent, the pro-life position, believes that the right to life is always going to outweigh the right to autonomy, the woman's right to do what she wants to with her body, the woman's choice and decision on how to govern her own life, how to determine how her life is going to go and what's to happen with her body, right? The pro-life position thinks that the right to life outweighs that right to autonomy. So how is Thomson going to go about arguing for her position? What Thomson does is offer a thought experiment, the violinist example. We're asked to imagine a situation where, against our will, we are kidnapped by a group of people who are fans of this particular violinist. So they kidnap you in order to hook you up to the violinist, because the violinist is really sick. And without your special blood, the violinist would die. So against your will, they go and they kidnap you, and then they hook you up to the violinist. So that way, your blood can keep the violinist alive for, let's say, 9 months or so. Then the question is simply, do you have a right to remove yourself from the violinist? Intuitively, most people think yes. I was kidnapped against my will. It's not something I decided to do. So if I choose, if I express my autonomy by removing myself from the violinist, even though the violinist will end up dying, nonetheless, I have the ability to do that. I have the right to do that because it's my body. Nobody has a right to tell me what to do with my body. So I don't have to use my blood to keep the violinist alive. That's the way this thought experiment is supposed to go, right? That's the intuition that Thomson thinks most people will have. So in a similar sort of situation, if you're raped or if for whatever reason against your will, you become pregnant, then you have the right to do what you want with your body. Even though the fetus is a person, just like the violinist is a person, and both have a right to life, nonetheless, they don't have the right to use your body, right? If you choose to disconnect yourself from the violinist or disconnect yourself from the fetus, you can do that. That's the general intuition that Thomson thinks that most of us will have in this sort of case, right? So again, the general intuition is that when you're hooked up to the violinist against your will, then it's morally permissible to disconnect yourself from the violinist, right? You didn't choose to be connected to them. And even though the violinist is a person, still your right to autonomy outweighs the violinist's right to life in this sort of case. So Thompson's response to the pro-life position is simply, if we think that in the violinist case we have a right to be disconnected, well, then we can't simply argue that abortion is morally impermissible by saying that the right to life is greater than the right to do what you want with your body, right? Because in the violinist case, it looks like your right to autonomy, your right to choose what to do with your body outweighs the violinist's right to life, right? So we can't simply suggest or argue that the right to life is always going to outweigh the right to autonomy, because in the violinist case, it doesn't. So that's Thomson's general response to the pro-life position. Now, notice that in order to make this argument work, what Thomson really needs is to be able to show that when we apply the violinist case to the cases of abortion, the ones that we're really interested in at least, then there's no morally significant difference between disconnecting oneself in the violinist case and disconnecting oneself in the case of abortion, right? If there's no morally significant difference in the violinist case, then there won't be in the case of abortion either. So then if that's true, then Thomson's able to show that even if the fetus is a person, still, at least in some cases, it's still going to be morally permissible to obtain an abortion, right? And what this really shows is that we're not trying to think of abortion in terms of the right to kill the fetus. Instead, we're thinking about it in terms of having a right to do what you want with your body, a right to autonomy. And in this particular case, it's the woman's choice, the woman's right to autonomy insofar as she's choosing to end the pregnancy. It's not so much a right to kill the fetus as much as it's a right to evacuate the womb, is the way that Thomson sometimes puts it. The right to terminate the pregnancy. And of course, that does involve, generally speaking, that the fetus will die. But that's not what the woman's desire is. It's not that the woman desires for the fetus to die. Rather, the woman desires not to be pregnant, right? In the same way that the woman doesn't necessarily desire, she doesn't want the violinist to die. She may be a big fan of the violinist also. It's just that the woman desires not to be hooked up to the violinist. So in this case, the woman's right to autonomy is going to outweigh the violinist or the fetus's right to life. This is the general argumentative structure. All right, so now let's think about some potential ways in which the pro-life position might object to Thomson's argument. All right. So first of all, we might think that, well, if we can identify any possible situations where there is a morally significant difference between the violinist case and some case of abortion, if there is a morally significant difference, then Thomson's argument simply won't go through. And so we need to make sure that it's not just any kind of difference. It has to be a morally significant difference. So one particular difference that sometimes is raised is the fact that when you're pregnant, you don't necessarily spend all 9 months in the hospital, right? It's only at the very end of the gestation, typically speaking, that the woman goes to the hospital, right? So at least in most cases of pregnancy, the woman can do lots of different things. But in the case of the violinist, well, we've kind of just stipulated this case such that the woman is stuck in her bed, attached to the violinist for this 9-month period. So that might be an important difference. But we have to think about whether or not this is going to be a morally significant difference. And I'm going to leave that to you to try to decide. There might be different ways in which we can approach this. And the thing is that Thomson might have different ways to respond to that kind of an objection too. Maybe Thomson can change the examples in some way. Maybe Thomson could change the examples so that the violinist is going to go around with the pregnant woman wherever she goes so that they're not stuck in the hospital the entire time. There's maybe different ways to approach this, but the main issue here is we need to think about the different ways in which this may or may not be a morally significant difference, right? And any particular difference that we think of, we have to ask whether it's morally significant. That's the key issue involved. Now, another really important objection that the pro-life position might offer is to say that, well, look, in most cases of abortion, the woman bears some sort of responsibility in the pregnancy, right? The woman, she engages in sexual activity, kind of knowing that there's this chance of pregnancy. But in the case of the violinist, you were kidnapped. It was against your will. So that looks like it might be a morally significant difference that we want to pay attention to, right? In the violinist case, you were kidnapped. But in most cases of abortion, the woman gets pregnant knowing that there's a chance of pregnancy, right? All right, so let's think about how Thomson might respond to these type of objections. So like we said a moment ago, it's always possible for Thomson to modify the violinist case in some way. Certainly in the situation where you're kidnapped, maybe Thomson would go about suggesting that you, in one way or another, hook yourself up voluntarily to the violinist, and that's a case that we're going to have to think about in more detail. But something else that Thomson brings up is that that there's two different sort of pro-life positions that one might take. On the one hand, we might take what she calls the extreme view. Now, the extreme pro-life position says that abortion is never, ever going to be morally permissible, not even in cases where the woman is raped, right? And that's an extreme view because it definitely says that the right to life always outweighs, it's always greater than anybody's right to autonomy, even if you're raped. So if you think about the violinist case, the extreme view would say that since the violinist is a person, then you do not have a right to disconnect yourself from the violinist, even in situations where you're kidnapped and you're hooked up against your will, right? Even in those extreme situations. Now, that's a different sort of a pro-life position than the more moderate position would say that only in the extreme case is abortion permissible. But in other sort of cases where, where the woman has some sort of responsibility for being pregnant, in those sort of cases, abortion would not be permissible. So that's a more moderate pro-life sort of position. And so one thing that we might say is that Thomson thinks that the violinist case is really an argument against the extreme view, right? It's an argument saying that in cases of rape, and those sort of cases where you become pregnant against your will in some way, then that's certainly a case where abortion is morally permissible because the right to autonomy would outweigh the fetus's right to life. Now, something else that we need to think about is we can compare the fetus to the woman, right? The fetus, we're already saying by stipulation that it has a right to life. The woman also has a right to life. But we need to ask whether or not both the fetus and the woman have a right to autonomy. Now, generally speaking, the right to autonomy involves being able to make decisions guiding your life, being able to make choices about how your life is going to go, make choices about how you want your body to be handled and so forth. It's kind of a right to determination, a right to self-determination. So if that's how we're thinking about the right to autonomy, then that already presupposes that you have some sort of cognitive abilities, some sort of intellectual abilities to recognize yourself as a self and being able to make choices for yourself. And in the case of the woman, it looks like she does have the right to autonomy insofar as she has the ability to make choices for herself, to govern her own life, to self-determine the way her life is going to go, right? But in the case of the fetus, that's not obvious at all. It's not clear at all that the fetus has any kind of a sense of a self or a cognitive capacity to make choices. In fact, if we were to say anything at all, we would have to say that the fetus might have a potential to have autonomy or potential to make choices. But at that moment, in the moment of gestation, the fetus lacks the ability to make choices. It lacks these sort of cognitive apparatus that's involved in being able to govern one's life and self-determine the way your life is going to go and so forth. So the fetus would not have a right to autonomy. So if we're to compare the fetus to the woman, then it looks like the woman has both a right to life and a right to autonomy, whereas the fetus only has a right to life. And so if we want to compare the two, we would say that we should side with the woman because she has more of a right to life and a right to autonomy. And in that situation, we might think that the woman's choices should outweigh the fetus because the fetus only has a right to life. And there's some other sort of cases, like the case of self-defense, where we might think that the right to autonomy would outweigh the fetus's right to life. So consider a case where the woman's life is being threatened by someone, right? So if your life or my life is being threatened, somebody's holding a gun to your head, well, it looks like we might have the right to self-defense. I could protect myself, even if that meant that that it involves killing the person who is threatening my life. And that's because my right to autonomy outweighs their right to life if they are threatening me in some way. And so in the same way, you might think that the woman's right to autonomy outweighs the fetus's right to life if it's the case that the fetus is threatening the woman in some way. Now, of course, that's a difficult situation because it's always open for the advocate of the pro-life position to say, look, the fetus is not threatening the woman's right to life, because in order to threaten, somebody's right to life, that means you have to, consciously choose to threaten their life. But the fetus, since the fetus doesn't have that sort of ability, then they're not really threatening the woman's right to life. But then at the same point, you might think, well, it doesn't necessarily involve making that choice. As long as there is a threat, regardless of whether or not the fetus is choosing to threaten the woman's right, as long as there is a threat in some sense, then the woman still has a right to defend her life, to defend her ability to do what she wants with her body and so forth, right? And so those are some difficult cases that we can think about, but these are different ways in which Thomson might respond to the pro-life position. And again, the general idea here is Thomson's trying to show that at least in some cases, the right to autonomy is going to outweigh, it's going to be greater than the fetus's right to life. Now, of course, a lot of this really depends upon which cases we're thinking about. Much of what Thomson's argument at this point relies upon is the notion that the woman becomes pregnant against her will. She becomes pregnant because she was raped, or in some other way she did not choose to become pregnant. In the same sort of way that in the violinist case, you did not choose to become hooked up to the violinist. That happened against your will. So you might think that the sort of cases that we're really interested in with regard to the problem of abortion, the sort of cases that makes the issue of abortion so controversial in the first place, involves cases where the woman is at least partially responsible for becoming pregnant. So you might think that the real objection to Thomson's argument is not really the extreme view or anything having to do with defending somebody's life, in a case where the fetus is threatening the woman's life. Rather, you might think that the real objection that we need to pay attention to are cases of abortion where the woman is in one way or another partly responsible for becoming pregnant. Cases where the woman engages in sexual relations knowing that there is some chance of becoming pregnant. So let's think about how Thomson might respond to this sort of a case. The way in which Thomson responds to this sort of objection is to try to show that in order to make the objection work, we really need to make the following conditional come out true. The conditional is, if the woman knows the risk of pregnancy, then abortion is not morally permissible, right? So the way in which we would show that this conditional comes out false is to try to show that abortion is morally permissible, even in cases where the woman knows the risk of sexual engagement, of sexual relations, right? Even if she's somewhat responsible for becoming pregnant, even in those cases, it's still true that that abortion is sometimes morally permissible, right? So how does Thomson show that that conditional is false? Well, in order to show that the conditional is false, we need to have a case where, on the one hand, the antecedent is true, right? Somebody knows the risks of something, but the consequent comes out false. Even though they know the risk of some sort of situation, we're still not going to hold them, in some sense, responsible for that situation. So what Thomson does is offer a few thought experiments to try to show how that conditional might come out false. The first thought experiment let's think about is the bars on the window. Thomson asks us to imagine a situation where we live in a neighborhood and there's some crime going on in that neighborhood, and we put some bars on the window. And we happen to leave the window open one night, unlocked, but we've got these bars on the window to prevent any burglars from coming in and breaking in and stealing our stuff. We know that it's at least possible for the burglar to break the bars. Maybe it's not very likely. In most cases, the bars are going to keep the burglar out, but it's at least possible. We know that. So if we happen to leave the windows open one night, and the burglar comes and breaks the bars and comes in and steals our stuff, are we morally responsible in that situation? Should we just willingly allow the burglar to take our stuff? Should we say, hey, look, I in some sense knew that it's at least possible for the bars to be broken, therefore go ahead and take my stuff? Thomson thinks that that's just ridiculous. Of course, if the burglar breaks through the bars, then we're free to still protect our stuff, even though we happen to leave the window open. So in this sort of situation, the bars are supposed to represent some kind of contraception, some way of at least attempting to keep the burglar out, even though we know that it's possible for that protection to fail in some situations. So if we think about contraception as being, for the most part, a good way to protect one from becoming pregnant, but even, in some situations the contraception might fail, well, then we're still not going to be held responsible, right? So in those cases, according to Thomson, abortion still is morally permissible because we took the right kind of precautions in the first place, though we did know that there was some chance of becoming pregnant. The other thought experiment that Thomson wants us to think about is the people seed thought experiment. Here, we're going to think about it in terms of, instead of having the bars put into place, we're going to have this really, really high-tech mesh put onto our windows. This mesh string is going to keep out any potential people seeds. Now, these people seeds, they're a funny sort of thing. They're these tiny, tiny, tiny little seeds that can get into our house, and they implant into our carpet. And then once they're implanted in the carpet, they then grow into people or persons. Of course, it's a thought experiment. It's not going to happen. This is just a ridiculous story. Nonetheless, the idea is supposed to be, if we put the mesh in place, this high-tech mesh that's supposed to keep the people seeds out, then that's going to be working in the same way that contraception is supposed to work. Even though we recognize that there's a very, very small chance that there could be some people seeds that still get through that mesh, because the mesh is not 100% going to work all the time. So if it turns out that one night we happen to leave the windows cracked a little bit, it's a really great night out, and we go to sleep before we remember to put the windows back down. And if it turns out that there's some people seeds that get through this mesh for one reason or another and gets implanted into our carpet, intuitively, it looks like we have the right to remove the people seed from our carpet. But according to this objection, the objection would say, no, you knew the chances, and so therefore you have to let the people seed grow into a person. But that just intuitively seems absurd, according to Thomson. So Thomson thinks that in both of these cases, the bars on the window and the people seeds, these are going to be cases where the antecedent of the conditional is true, but the consequent turns out false. In other words, even though the woman knows the risks of the pregnancy, if she is using contraception and is taking the right kind of precautions and still gets pregnant, then she does still have a right to autonomy, which will allow her to obtain an abortion. In the same way that you would have a right to protect yourself if the burglar is stealing your things, or to remove the people seeds when they're implanted in the carpet. In those situations, someone knows the risks, but we don't think that they are forced to allow the seeds to develop into people or allowed to let the burglar come and steal your things. So those are the sort of ways in which Thomson would respond to these objections. Of course, it's a completely different question of whether or not these are going to count as good objections. So I want you to think about that, and you'll be discussing these issues in your reading response.